one thing I've noticed in my many years of being around Tibetans, the monks and the Rinpoches, going to Tibet and all that, and Tibetan Buddhism in general, is how they approach criticism. And by here I mean being personally critical of another person. And we Americans are really good at it. In the beginning, I used to think that their attitude toward making personal comments might be just that old cliche of Oriental inscrutability, and being reserved when it comes to being personal. They don't get personal. But I finally kind of gave that thought up because it didn't seem to be true. Their attitude rather seems to reflect the Buddhist philosophy about the self, at least among the high Rinpoches that I've met. And my guess is that in their view, being critical of or addressing someone's self, their person, is like just talking about the symptoms without reaching the core. In other words, true to Buddhist philosophy, Buddhists don't consider the personal self to have any permanent existence or even to be an entity. So probably they don't bother to be critical of it. You know, they want to go beyond that to what's really important, to who we are beyond ourself. I mean, this is just me talking now. Anyway, to make a joke, to the Buddhist, self may be something of a non-entity. And their view is much deeper, and I believe better than that. But I found that I have to take a lesson from them. I still have to do it, and reorganize my own thinking on this topic. After all, I am not only a professional music critic, or was, but I am very, very critical in general, and certainly not above sharing my criticism with those that I'm critical of, and getting very personal at it too, I'm sorry to say. I mean, it's always been a mess. I've been told this is not one of my most endearing qualities, and my tendency to be very direct and to not beat around the bush only makes me harder to take for some people. I can understand this. Anyway, the Buddhists don't take the self as seriously as we do in the West, as I have. Not only that, they believe that each one of us has what's called Buddha nature. And beneath the self, beyond the self, at heart, that we're a living Buddha that has not yet recognized his or her own nature. They not only believe this, but they act on their belief by addressing not the personality, not being personally critical, not talking to the self or at the self, but they talk to the Buddha, what we call Buddha nature, that is within each of us. Now, I'm finally getting my mind around to this approach, and I must say it's totally superior to what I've been doing or trying to do all these years. So the Rinpoches seem to skip over or not criticize or address the personality. I've seen this a lot. But they speak only to the Buddha inside of us. So instead of laying down the law, reprimanding us for having this personal or that personal bad habits or whatever, they tend to be respectful of the Buddha within us. And they do their very best to point things out that might be helpful to that being. All I can say is what a great idea, and I need to learn how to do that. For example, I always wondered how Khenpo Kata Rinpoche, the Lama that I've worked with for 30 years, how he could be so kind to other people. It used to really bother me that he would take as much time with just any old person he met, even if they were rude, as he would with me. After all, I was, at least to my mind, devoted, respectful, and these outsiders, many of them were just rude in many cases. I'll give you one example. I remember one particular time when Rinpoche was speaking at a local university, and there were, of course, many students present. Some of the students had come to hear a talk about Buddhism, about the Dharma, but some of them just on a lark, just to see what Tibetans were like. And worse, they would ask Rinpoche rude questions. I mean, questions they would never dare ask their own parents or their parents' friends. Here's a Rinpoche that was at that time in his 80s, and they would ask him questions like, "How is your sex life?" Now that really irritated me, the sheer disrespect to someone that I respected so much. Yet Rinpoche never batted an eye. He would patiently, carefully, and lovingly answer each question, like the above question about his sex life, with answers like, "Me, a fat old man," things like that. I guess my point here is that Rinpoche, and perhaps Tibetans in general, or at least Rinpoches, are somehow able to look beyond the person of each of us to the Buddha nature within us, and they always address that. And the inner Buddha within all of us, each of us, is deserving of real respect. I mean, what a future that we have eventually to discover that about ourselves. Anyway, I can finally understand their approach. Perhaps that's why instead of offering personal criticism, as I like to do or tend to do, they only point out things that might be helpful, and always with a gentle tone. And they're pointing it out to the Buddha in us, not trying to mess with our personality and clean that mess up. They know to whom they're speaking. And now that I think of it, my very first Dharma teacher, even before I got into Buddhism many years, would repeatedly say to me this phrase. He would make me remember all this stuff. And what he said was, and I quote, "5 things observe with care. To whom you speak, of what, why, when, and where." This now makes a lot of sense to me.